Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of our Fall Science of Reading webinar week, Comprehension Connections, Building the Bridge Between Reading and Understanding. My name is Victoria, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. Every day this week, we've been hosting webinars at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, exploring reading comprehension. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording link via email later this week. If you'd like to access closed captioning, please click on the CC button in the bottom tray and then show captions. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for today's session, as well as all the other sessions you've attended live. Be sure to register for the rest of the series at amplify.com/fall SOR webinars. And Deb, if you would move ahead, there you go. Yes. So tomorrow we're very, very excited to have our final session in this week of webinars, Finding the Missing Link in Reading Comprehension to Boost Literacy Success. It's tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. And then if you missed any of the sessions earlier this week, feel free to revisit using the link above, amplify.com/fall SOR webinars. Watch at your leisure and absolutely feel free to share with a colleague. We welcome comments in the chat throughout today's presentation. And to start, I would love to hear where everyone is joining us from. I'm from Cleveland, go Guardians, and the weather here is absolutely beautiful. Enjoying the perfect October so far. And then Deb, if you would go ahead and click next. Yeah, now I'm going to introduce our wonderful speaker. Deb Sabin is Amplify's Chief Academic Officer of Amplify ELA and has spent over 20 years in the education industry. She is focused on key areas of literacy development, critical thinking, and student engagement at the middle school level. And today she's going to be presenting on comprehension in middle school, more important than ever. Welcome, Deb, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joined our webinar today. Victoria was actually spent over 3 decades in the education space, working within and learning about secondary ELA and literacy, both as a teacher, an administrator, a trainer, and a curriculum developer. And now at Amplify, really kind of leading content and pedagogy for the secondary reading space. I will say that although I've been in this space for decades, because my focus has been secondary, I kind of came late to the science of reading party. And to be honest, I would say that the known and confirmed science in the secondary space has also lagged behind what's known about early reading. But that kind of means it's a really exciting time to be involved in secondary literacy space because the level of science and research is truly starting to bubble up for secondary literacy. So the type of work you guys are engaged at as secondary teachers and administrators thinking about best practices for readers is timely and meaningful. I have 3 goals for us today. I want to help us better understand the role of language comprehension, or more broadly, knowledge for the secondary reader, and to consider how we support comprehension, how we support knowledge building in our classrooms to drive comprehension. And then also to think not only about reading, but to broaden our discussion to consider how writing and discourse can be powerful contributors to reading proficiency. And as Victoria said, there'll be some time at the end for Q&A. So you should have a space in your toolbar for Q&A, and you can put those questions in there, and we'll be looking at those questions at the end. So let's start a little bit with just a review of the science of reading. The science of reading refers to known and growing research that deconstructs how students learn how to read. Reading proficiency requires a complex combination of skills. There are 2 main frameworks that can help us break it all down: the simple view of reading and the reading rope. So let's look first at the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading represents how the brain learns to process words on a page. And this understanding of how the brain reads has been around for a significant period and has been validated many times through research. So what does this equation represent? It kind of is talking about how reading proficiency is the product of 2 elements, 2 things: language comprehension and word recognition. And it's important to think of it as the product of those two things, not the sum. So if we go back to our math days, we know if we put a 0 on either side of that multiplication sign, we end up with someone who cannot read. Um, so if I think of language or word recognition, I can often read Italian words. I can decode them. I can maybe even pronounce them, but I don't have any language comprehension to draw any meaning from those words when I pronounce them. Similarly, if we think about language comprehension, about my husband can understand and comprehend music, so he can hear the notes changing, he can hear the rhythm, but he can't decode musical notes on a musical score. So he can't similarly read a musical score. So we need to pay attention to both of those elements to ensure that students become proficient readers. So let's look at each of those a little bit, and we're going to dive into them more when we talk about secondary readers. So language comprehension is the ability to understand and make sense of the spoken language. This is something natural. Humans are born with areas of the brain that are dedicated to oral language development. At birth, babies start to take in all the language they hear. This is receptive language. And over time, they start to express the language that's modeled for them, expressive language. Humans develop their vocabulary and grammar through this natural receptive capacity in our brains for hearing, comprehension, and then developing language. And our students come to school with oral language comprehension. Some students are going to have more background knowledge, more vocabulary, even more language, and more experience in an oral environment. And those distinctions are really important for early readers because our ability to make meaning from language is dependent on the knowledge we gain about world and words. But students do come with a natural capacity for language comprehension. And that's critical because the starting place for reading is actually speech, so our ability to hear words. If we think about word recognition is reading words on the page, literally the ability to see letter shapes and translate those letter shapes into sound. That's called decoding. This eventually happens with automaticity, but it's not something that happens naturally. So reading instruction really has to build the bridge between oral language, what we are wired to process, and the code on the page. It needs to be taught explicitly through about 2 years of instruction because it involves actual rewiring and remapping certain structures of the brain so that we can move from recognized sounds, phonemes, to specific letter patterns, phonics. And I can say I can give a basic time frame for this of 2 years because there's only a finite set of skills to learn. You have to learn all the patterns in the English language and or whatever language it tends to be. Once those are in place, word recognition can happen with increasing automaticity. Again, this is the first framework of the science of reading, but again, it's important to think about always about reading as the product of these two elements. But the second framework that we're going to spend more time talking about is the reading rope. So Dr. Hollis Scarborough is an American expert focused on reading acquisition, really thinking about mainly dyslexia. And she developed this analogy of a rope to help us think of skilled reading as resembling the strands of a rope, illustrating the interconnectedness and interdependence of all the components on both sides of that word recognition and language comprehension equation. So here you can see those distinct strands that make up word recognition. So the sounds we make represented by letters, and those letters in combination making up words, and then also the different strands that make up language comprehension. And I think of language comprehension broadly as our knowledge of the world and words, but it's vocabulary that allows us to draw meaning from sentences and across sentences, and that allows us to make a reasonable inference or conversation of the text and to begin to build a mental model of that situation being described in the text. So early reading kind of attends to these explicitly. So if we look at the sentences on the right, early readers are using their word recognition skills to decode Rosa rode home in the snow. She longed for her gloves, and maybe they're working on long O and short O sounds. But they're also pulling on their language, their knowledge of the word and world, to kind of understand that snow means it's likely cold outside, to think about the fact that the verb in their rode means that Rosa's not walking, and pulling those together, those two sentences, to connect the pronoun she to the name Rosa. And that all comes together into the situational mental model of Rosa riding a bike in the snow. So once that situational model is in place for the reader can infer that Rosa probably wishes she had gloves because her hands are cold because of the snowy weather, even if the words don't say that's why she's longing for gloves. So note that this situational model, this picture, is reliant on broad and specific knowledge of words, language, and the world, those language comprehension areas. But at this stage, a lot of that knowledge is based on everyday experiences that students come into school with. And that's good because the bulk of that reader's cognitive energy is going towards that decoding, actually turning the code on the page into words that they can hear. This shifts in about third or fourth grade. At that age, those two large strands come together and are increasingly interconnected. So if early reading instruction has been successful, and we hope that it is, but we know that there are often gaps. But when it is successful, kids are becoming very automatic in their word recognition. They need this automaticity with word recognition in order to shift their cognitive energy into developing, expanding, and applying their knowledge to read and understand. So that's where kind of comprehension starts to really draw on their developed knowledge. So let's look at the interplay between those two strands for the secondary reader. So if we know that we looked at the early reader reading Rosa, we're now looking at the secondary reader and how both those strands are now very interconnected. So again, ideally, there's increasing automaticity with decoding and encoding. And yes, students are still going to apply those skills explicitly because you're going to be encountering new words, multisyllabic words. And fluency continues to be very important, fluency practice. But as I said before, there's a finite set of word recognition skills. There's a limited number of phonemes and graphemes, although they can be put together in endless patterns. But again, they're applying a limited set of skills to those word recognition. But think about those language comprehension strands. Really, these knowledge areas where readers must continue to develop and strategically apply their knowledge in order to grow reading proficiency. And that knowledge increasingly moves beyond the realm of everyday experiences and is reliant on knowledge built through academic experiences. So that's where our classrooms really start to play a big role in the knowledge that drives comprehension. Because secondary readers have fewer sentences about Rosa in the snow, so fewer sentences with that nice decodable text, where a lot of the knowledge is pulling from their everyday experiences. And instead, they're going to encounter sentences like this that move up in complexity with increasingly complex syntaxes, with less familiar vocabulary, that require more academic knowledge, not knowledge from everyday conversation and experiences. So when we read 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Again, some of those words are going to require them to strategically apply their word recognition skill, but most of their cognitive energy is now pulling on their knowledge, and comprehension is increasingly reliant on academic rather than everyday knowledge. So if we think about those strands in this sentence, background knowledge. A child's experience of the world was a dominant source of knowledge. That's still true in the secondary, but there are additional sources and types of knowledge students are building. So background knowledge now includes facts and concepts and academic content, so what you have learned in years past, what you have learned in areas like science and social studies. And a lot of this knowledge increasingly comes from the text that students are reading. So there's a circular feedback loop to keep in mind here. The more knowledge that students have, the more they can gain because our brains are developed to integrate new knowledge into pre-existing schema. So ideally, when students read that sentence about from the Gettysburg Address, they have some knowledge that can be activated when they hear the term founding fathers, when they hear the word declaration. They might have some existing knowledge about Lincoln. Hopefully, they have some background about the Civil War and slavery, because those sources of knowledge are going to be increasingly important for their comprehension of this new text. So the need for developing this type of knowledge schema does really point to the importance of a well-sequenced knowledge curriculum. So the texts and the text sequences that we put in front of students matter. They support students to build background knowledge that then drives comprehension. So again, we can do a lot of practice with something like main idea, but if students don't have that background knowledge potentially that they need to draw on to think about this text, the Gettysburg Address, then they're missing something beyond just their ability to parse a main idea. The same principle holds true with vocabulary knowledge. Students are not just learning individual words and definitions, they're mapping semantic information. So when they encounter a word like proposition in that text, ideally they're fitting that word into an existing schema and mapping connections. So maybe they've heard the word propose and they have some idea, oh, my brother just proposed to his girlfriend, and then they can make a connection between that word and this new word. That takes the new word from short-term working memory and processes it back into that developing schema that's in their long-term memory. And ideally, doing this, students are developing a breadth, a depth, and a flexibility with their understanding of words. So it's not just individual words, but those words are being mapped into a schema that they can access. And again, there's a reciprocal relationship here between reading and vocabulary. The more students read, the more words they're exposed to, and the more they're working at the word level with the text, the more they're exposed to how words work. And the more they understand how words work, the more they can read. So again, the curriculum implication for secondary readers, it's important that texts expose them to a wide breadth and depth of vocabulary words, and that core instruction provide purposeful work with those words. Text structures, let's move on to that strand. There's an area of comprehension that involves students' knowledge of sentences and text structures. Again, for early readers with simpler sentences, there's a strong overlap between the sentence structures they hear in everyday conversations and what they see on the page. Upper grade readers, however, are going to encounter a wider variety of sentence and text structures as they're exposed to more text. So our long sentence from Gettysburg is not the type of construction we hear in everyday oral conversation. When I see that type of sentences, readers are going to need to track, perhaps with support, the subject and predicate. They're going to need to parse phrases and clauses to hopefully notice, like, it's the nation and not the fathers that was conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality. And ideally, they're starting to develop a knowledge of certain genre conventions. So like a speech, so that when they are told by their teacher, we're going to read this speech, Gettysburg Address, they're already kind of pulling on that knowledge to think about, oh, a speech is, who is the speaker of this speech? Who is the audience? What is occasion? They have some familiarity with that genre. Again, another curriculum implications. Middle grade readers and above, they have to work with a range of text structures, including a variety of informational text structures. I put that percentage down there, 75 informational. It's not because all their ELA classes should be focused on presenting 75% informational text. It's just the idea that most of what they are encountering in across a school day is informational text, and therefore part of what we are doing in the ELA classroom in middle school is preparing them for those encounters. And we want to ensure that they're not just reading those texts, but that instruction is embedding explicit work around text structures. So just as our early readers drew on their knowledge to develop that mental model of Rosa in the snow, our secondary readers are synthesizing their sources of knowledge to construct meaning, even from that one sentence in Gettysburg. So it literally involves drawing upon all the knowledge that's built in their long-term memory and some of what you might be giving them at that moment. So my previous classroom content learning about the Civil War, the Declaration, my experiential familiarity with the word dedicate, my ability to connect proposition to proposal or propose, all those get stored as schema and then activated at this moment to help me develop a mental model of their text along with the specific words in that sentence. So summing up, as students enter the secondary grades, word recognition becomes increasingly more automatic. It's also harder, and they're going to continue to benefit from practice parsing and pronouncing some of those multisyllabic words. You'll see readers pause a beat when they get to something like proposition, and literally they're kind of mentally sounding out that word, but they have the skills to do it. And they will absolutely need regular fluency practice as those syntaxes and sentences become longer and more complex. But they are depending on continuous development of their knowledge, their world knowledge, their word knowledge, their text knowledge in order to comprehend that sentence. So knowledge becomes the infinite and critical area for growing comprehension and reading proficiency. So yes, science of reading does point to a set of skills that we need to read, but even more with secondary readers, science of reading points to the areas of knowledge we need to be addressing. And the sources of all those strands of knowledge, words, world, sentences, have expanded beyond oral language. It's not just what we hear, it's what we're reading, it's what we're discussing, it's what we're writing. All modes of language contribute to developing the knowledge that really drives comprehension. So if you've seen me present in the past, this is normally the moment where I end. We've talked about how reading is dependent on developing those language comprehension strands for the secondary reader. Hopefully I've shown that building these knowledge areas is dependent on engagement with a rich and carefully curated selection of grade level texts, and that classroom literacy practices should explicitly target background knowledge, developing word knowledge, working with a variety of text structures, including informational texts. But now I want to talk about how writing and discourse, those expressive modes of language, are well positioned to work alongside reading to support this work of building knowledge and improving comprehension. Research is increasingly pointing to this kind of role of writing and discourse and the role they can play in students developing and working with knowledge. There's a little bit of shorthand like, you want to see two kind of working together in your ELA classroom. So reading and writing, reading and speaking, writing and speaking. When two are connected, and sometimes even three, you're really compounding the benefits of each. But let's talk about writing. The Carnegie Foundation conducted a meta-analysis of a multitude of research studies to examine the effects of different writing practices on students' reading performances. The study found that writing about text, teaching writing, and writing more regularly all had a positive impact on students' reading proficiency. So for example, there's one small study that compared students writing a summary of what they had just read to other forms of reviewing their knowledge. So they gave them a piece of reading. They told the students to take a piece of paper, write a summary. Other students were given kind of multiple choice questions alongside their reading. Other students were asked to highlight in the text. And then they came back a week later and they asked a set of questions about that text that they had read. And they found that the students who had written that summary, just turned over that reading and written that summary based on what they remembered from that reading, correlated with the largest knowledge gain. And that's true for these types of writing and reading overall. So let's think about why and what is the secret sauce of writing in terms of its impact on reading comprehension. So here's a student writing prompt embedded in a lesson where students have been reading an early section of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And at this point of the text, after his Frankenstein's mother has just died, and Victor Frankenstein becomes obsessed with determining the elixir of life, and his studies kind of take him to extremes. So after reading about his intense grief and his obsessive studies, students are asked to write for 10 minutes to this prompt. Is Victor more focused on life, on death, or on both as he investigates and makes his creation? Explain your answer using specific details from the text. So here's a response by one 8th grade student, and I'm going to read it out loud. I think that Victor is more interested in life than death. The text states, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. Page 22, chapter 1. This evidence shows that he was looking for a way to cure a human life if they have a sickness. He wanted to find a cure for people when they get sick and are most likely going to die so they can live. According to the text, it states, if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. Chapter 1, page 22. This evidence shows that he wanted to take away a disease from people that are really sick and could die. He wanted people to have life. He felt like he could take away a sickness that can kill someone. He would feel like he has done the impossible and he would feel proud of himself. It's not a perfect piece of writing, but let's look at what this student has done. So first, the student has selected particular sentences, particular text evidence that I've highlighted in yellow. And that's a strong sign of comprehension. So both those quotes are relevant to the prompt given and are kind of from a critical point in the text. But let's look at, more importantly, in what the student is doing with that text when we think of comprehension. So here we have the student unpacking a complex syntax and paraphrasing the idea it contains. So the student takes that quote, the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, difficult concepts, and paraphrases that to looking for a way to cure human life if they have sickness. You can literally see the student kind of writing down the meaning they are making from that sentence. They're kind of writing out the mental model that's occurring to them as they elaborate on that quote. And then let's look a little further down and we'll see the student parsing vocabulary. So the student in that second quote from the text takes that vocabulary, banish disease, and again, paraphrases it or finds a synonym for that word to take away a disease. So the student is putting those complex vocabulary words into a framework of similar words. So putting that vocab word into a schema, into a word family. So when you read this writing, you can see that you can kind of see the student's mental model of the text emerging and their knowledge solidifying. And that's because writing done right encodes knowledge. So encoding and learning is the initial process of taking new information from our environment, our working or short-term memory, and converting it into a format that can be stored, consolidated in the brain's storage system, its long-term memory. So again, we have working memory, that's our temporary, and it's a limited workspace for organizing information. And then we have long-term memory, and that's a nearly infinite storage system for our knowledge. And you can see, I think the image on the right is supposed to be a brain. Is a picture of a brain. I'm just going to say it's a picture of the brain because I was showing this image to my husband and he thought it was a picture of a cheese board. So it's a picture of a brain with knowledge going into that brain. Um, a lot of the information from school stays in short-term memory. Students use it for a minute and they move along. They use it for that particular task. They see it up on the board, they access it, they apply it to what they're doing, and they move along. We are trying to support ways to encode more of that information from reading into that long-term storage, to consolidate that information, to build those knowledge strands. And writing helps push knowledge into that long-term memory. So all those elements that we noted in that student's writing, they were paraphrasing information, they were elaborating on what the text said explicitly, they were making connection between word families. That's all work where the student is actively processing information. And you can see from the diagram that those moments of elaboration, active information processing, making connection, really support this encoding process and therefore the consolidation into long-term memory. So encoding knowledge and consolidating it, yes, it absolutely supports comprehension of that single passage of text, those pages from Frankenstein. But more importantly, information in long-term memory can be retrieved as types of knowledge that is so crucial to those strands of language comprehension. So when a student might hear that term elixir later on, and they will be able to retrieve that knowledge about elixir from Frankenstein and apply it to a new situation. Um, and in all those ways, you're building up their facility, their ability to use those language comprehension strands strategically when they're reading. So writing can support comprehension because it helps consolidate knowledge. What are the hallmarks of the type of knowledge that really have high impact? It really is writing connected to text. So it's writing where students have to use the text. That could be text analysis, text summaries, text notes even. It can also be writing at the sentence level. So you can have structured sentence practice that's asking students to use the text. And that supports sentence practice that supports them experimenting with sentence structure and with vocabulary. It is writing that is regularly embedded within literacy instruction. So most classrooms write very infrequently, sometimes very disconnected from their reading, and often they're only producing anything of even paragraph length monthly. So you want to make sure that you're embedding writing right into your reading practice. High impact writing also involves receiving feedback that reflects on the reading and writing. And I know for any of us who have been middle school teachers, the volume at which we can provide feedback on writing is limited compared to what we wish we could do. Remember, there's other types of feedback, sharing with peers, comparing your writing to peers, with the class, um, reviewing and revising writing based on some overall prompt that the teacher is giving. But this type of feedback really helps students. It surfaces their misunderstanding, allows them to go back to the text and think again and then revise, and it can crystallize their understanding. And text-based writing can also showcase a variety of perspectives around a text and topic, and that's kind of engaging for kids. Oh, that person thought that Frankenstein was more focused on death. Wait, let me see what they had to say. What did they write? Um, and it's really important to have clear expectations and routines for any writing that you're doing. And I would suggest repeating those expectations and routines multiple times. Writing demands a lot of cognitive energy. It's really drawing on higher order thinking, and you want that cognitive energy really devoted to the task at hand rather than focused on kind of internalizing, understanding a new set of directions and a new set of expectations. So how might you build this type of writing into your classroom? We talked about, or I showed you an example of embedded writing. Really, in your reading lessons, embedding evidence-based writing prompts. Here's another one from Frankenstein. Using evidence from the text, explain why Victor runs away from the creature. We've just done a close reading. We've looked at the different words he chooses when he first views his creation. And now we're asking students to pull those ideas together and to continue to develop their mental model by writing about that moment. You want to consider the prompt. You don't want a prompt to be too wide, because then students are just skimming the surface of a text or often not even writing about the text. Write about one decision, whether you agree with the decision the character makes. Often students will write one sentence about the text and then go on to their own thinking about it, that situation. Um, so not too wide, but also not too narrow. So you don't want to just be pushing them to produce one correct answer. You want them to have a moment to grapple with the text and really think about, what is my mental model of the text in this moment? And you want the prompt to push students to elaborate using the text. Because remember, we talked about that idea of elaboration being a critical kind of element of encoding. And again, it's as much about routines and expectations as about the prompt. So the routine is something that gets embedded regularly, and there's some time provided for feedback, particularly peer-to-peer feedback. Also note that it does not just have to be the paragraph and longer level. So try structured sentence practice. The one that I modeled or the one that you see here is from the Writing Revolution by Judith Hochman and Natalie Wexler. And they have some great examples of how to use this practice. In this situation, what you can see in front of you is the because, but, so model, where students have the same sentence stem, and the way that they end that sentence depends on that conjunction. So Victor wanted to find the elixir of life because Victor wanted to find the elixir of life, but Victor wanted to find the elixir of life. So I could do something very similar with my Gettysburg example, the Gettysburg Address. I want to target complexity in the text, and I'm trying to think about how one of the things that Lincoln is doing in that text is really thinking about, how the nation was founded, where we are now, and what he's trying to convince his audience to do. So I might give them the sentence stem. Lincoln says the nation was conceived in liberty, but Lincoln said the nation was conceived in liberty. So Lincoln said the nation was conceived in liberty because. These types of sentence stems and sentence practice support students to paraphrase the text, to synthesize ideas from the text, and to draw meaning from the text. Again, all those things that support encoding. So there's a couple of possible things to do in your own classrooms, again, to kind of start this type of writing that really builds the knowledge that drives future comprehension. Let's turn to discourse now and what research says about talking about text. So students reach higher levels of thinking and reading comprehension through text-centered discourse, where students reason, think together, and build on one another's ideas. I want to put an underline under that word thinking, think together. Similar to writing, discourse done right gets into the realm of higher order thinking, where we're actively processing information. However, not all discourse is equal, so we'll talk about the hallmarks of quality discourse, because the research points out some of these hallmarks where certain forms of discourse are better than others for supporting reading proficiency. So how do we strive for quality discourse about text? Quality discourse about text. There are lots of discussions about books that are high quality but are not really focused on the text. And I would raise my hand and said, many of my book club sessions, my neighborhood book club sessions, we have fantastic conversation and we really don't talk about the text. for a large percentage of that. And there are a lot, in fact, observationally, the majority of discussions about text in classrooms, they are about the text. They are text dependent, but they don't contain the hallmarks of quality discourse in terms of building and consolidating knowledge. So the most common type of text discourse observed is what's called IRE, and the IRE stands for initiate, respond, evaluate. This is incredibly common. We spend a lot of time doing this in classrooms. I ask a question, a student provides a response to that question, maybe raising their hand, and I evaluate their response for correctness. It's really good for fact checking, and it's useful for retrieval, right? That's the process of quickly drawing knowledge and presenting it. That's really important, but it is less useful for the type of encoding in terms of consolidating knowledge back the other way, taking knowledge and consolidating it into long-term memory. And that's what we're looking for. Discourse really can be a key driver of supporting those knowledge strands and building comprehension, but you want to build in discourse practices that focus on real meaning making with the text, because that's the type of discourse that targets those higher order thinking skills, where you're asking students to elaborate on the text, to make connections, to compare and refine ideas, to actively process their information. So in addition to text-dependent questions with one correct answer, consider facilitating discussions that focus on a section of text where there might be a range of interpretations. So here's one example. Here I've altered that earlier writing prompt about Victor Frankenstein into a discussion where kids rate their understanding along a continuum, choose a quote, and do a quick explanation. So simple sentence, simple directions. Review this part of the reading. Maybe we've just done a deep dive into that section of reading. There's that prompt. Is Victor more focused on life or death or both? Select a quote that reflects your thinking. Review your quote and rate Victor's focus. There's my continuum. Sometimes I might even have the kids stand up. I'm drawing that line at the front of the board. Only life, mainly life, all the way through to only death. And then I'm going to use all three here. They've read. Now they're going to jot down 2 or 3 sentences. It might be bullet points, but probably sentences explaining how the quote they chose reveals Victor's feelings about the creature. Then I set up a structured pair discussion where going back to the text is part of the routine. So again, pretty simple directions, and this is a routine that I would use repeatedly so that students would know this routine. Compare your responses with a partner. You said only death. I said mainly life. Each person should use the text to try to convince your partner that your answer is right. That's just a little bit of competitive juices going. And at the bottom of your sheet, note how the discussion did or did not change your understanding. So again, I'm setting up a situation where they're explaining and elaborating on their answer to a peer. It's part of the routine. They're comparing and making connections to another person's interpretation or to another part of the text that another student has used. That's part of the routine. They're rethinking their own reading, which is built into the routine. There's even that little bit of healthy peer-to-peer competition. All of this supports meaning making, and it also drives engagement. We kind of call this routine text as referee, but the critical part is that it supports the type of discourse known as accountable talk. And accountable talk is the key hallmark of text discourse that builds comprehension, that drives knowledge. So it's discussion that kind of sticks closely to the text. It supports kids to reason using the evidence, to connect ideas, to ask for clarification or elaboration. It focuses on structured routines and protocols. So it provides clear guides, supports, and expectation. Those result in high participation. So you're trying to catch all your students, and it allows them to continue to get better and better at this skill. And then your teacher talk moves kind of move away from evaluative, and really you're thinking about revoicing a student's response, or how do I link what one student said to something another student said? How do I get students to, how do I support them to reason more when they provide an answer? How do I get one student to add on to something that another student said? And also wait time becomes really important. So it's different than the type of response or the type of teacher moves that you use for initiate, respond, evaluate. And accountable talk includes both inquiry and comprehension-based discourse. So sometimes you're really trying to get the students to just provide the mental model of what they have taken from the text. And sometimes you're really asking a question that will have a wide range of interpretations. So how to build this type of model into your classroom. Again, we talked about use the text as referee. Um, it is a place where you are comparing a response with a partner and you're going back to the text to convince the partner that your answer is right. Or it might be look at the text together and come up with one answer that you both agree on. That's another way to do it. But it does involve, for text as referee, that moment of reflection. How did this discussion change my understanding or not? Um, you have to give kids time to respond. You have to give kids a clear discussion goal. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to convince them of this. You have to have a protocol that sends students back to the text. So I'm rethinking again about the text, or I'm using the text. Ideally, you are providing discussion stems. You see those on the right, and that opportunity to reflect and evaluate. And again, those discussion stems are super important, as are potential moments where you model this type of discussion with a student and give them opportunities to, to practice. Because we're not very good currently in all moments in this nation in having a dialogue and having a back and forth where we're building on each other's ideas. It's a great thing to model. All right, so what are the takeaways from today about comprehension in the middle school classroom? It is a reality that far too many of our secondary students are struggling with reading and are reading below grade level. And it is also a reality that the science of reading tells us that students missing those basic word recognition skills, or with gaps in those skills, will continue to struggle at all ages. And we need to identify those students and fill in the gaps. But it is also true that all our secondary readers, struggling or at grade level, must continue to develop and expand those knowledge areas, those language comprehension strands, to expand their reading proficiency, to build their comprehension. So we do that through a carefully sequenced selection of grade level text, really thinking about the vocabulary the text presents, the variety of text structures, the range of knowledge areas. And we do that through reading practices that explicitly target background knowledge, sentence and text structures, vocabulary development. And discourse and writing, and perhaps writing in particular, are critical tools for developing and expanding these knowledge areas and driving reading proficiency. Okay, so my hope is that I've given all of you all the permission you need to center rich text, rich discussion, and regular writing about text into your reading classrooms. I'm going to end a little presumptively by slightly rewriting this quote of E.M. Forster, which nicely sums up the idea that we can solidify text knowledge through writing and speaking. How can I know what I think until I see what I say or write? Thank you. You've been a great audience. I'm now going to try to answer some questions and access the Q&A. There it is. All right, I have some questions. How can we help middle school multilingual learners when they come in as newcomers lacking all background knowledge taught in the US in K-3, which often are included in topics? It's a really good question in ELA 4-8. So I think the focus of your question is really thinking about, I'm about to, let's dive into the beast of the belly. I'm about to do the Gettysburg Address, and this kid just arrived 6 months ago, and they have no knowledge of US history or any of this situation. So I do think that is a moment where we need to pull that student aside and pre-teach a little bit. It doesn't have to be every battle in the Civil War. What is the minimum that we need to access that text? So maybe it is really clear. It can be even a couple paragraphs or potentially a short video that has them have a sense of like, there are a timeline. Here are the 3 things you need to know. America was founded using this key document, the Declaration of the United States, that says all men are created equal. America also was founded with the institution of slavery. At 100 years after the Declaration was written, America went to war to decide about slavery. So you can imagine, but I think it can feel so overwhelming, the amount of knowledge that a student might potentially be lacking. I think you really want to look at the text, and you want to think about what is the most basic entry point for that text. And there are many useful and many unuseful uses for AI, but I think being able to write a really short paragraph at a really basic English level about, you give it a bullet list of these 4 things, it can really do a nice job, and that will allow you to pull a group and pre-teach. I agree with the writing portion of what you're explaining. Curious as to why would a 5th-grade dyslexic decline in writing skills year over year? I would say, just as I mean, I would have to see the student and know overall. My sense is just as that there is a very strong reciprocal relationship between writing, driving, reading knowledge. There's also a very strong reciprocal relationship between reading, driving, writing knowledge. So if a student is really struggling to kind of understand and work with those more complex text structures, then that might be evident in the way they are writing and forming those sentences. So one of the things that we see in the secondary writing space is that students really make this transition from simple sentence structures to complex sentence structures. And they often, their writing is ahead of their ability to structure complex sentences. So we start to see, gosh, I had a kid that was never writing in run-on sentences. Suddenly I'm seeing a lot of run-on sentences. And part of it is that their thinking is ahead of their writing. They are thinking complex thoughts, but they don't have the sentence structures down yet. That can be particularly a pitfall for dyslexic students. And so really kind of taking like that structured writing practice in the writing revolution helps students understand how to structure their thoughts using particular sentence structures. I'm just checking on the time. All right. Writing also, could writing in a computer versus handwriting, what is the difference? There are interesting studies that actually do point out that writing something by hand does seem to lead to stronger encoding than writing on a computer. So I do think you want to vary both writing on the computer and writing by hand, knowing that right now there is a sense of when you are transcribing the words, actually writing on print, there seems to be a stronger encoding that happens. However, we also know that students in the secondary space are just entering in a world where they will do almost all their writing on the computer. Would you recommend using the same text for different prompts to reduce cognitive load so the students can focus on the job prompt? Yes. I mean, I wouldn't recommend like you have 5 paragraphs and you're just having them write about those 5 paragraphs again and again and again. But a good chapter of a book is worth rereading from different lenses. And anything that's worth rereading from different lenses is an opportunity to have them write about that particular lens in short embedded, not in long writing, but in like 3 to 4, 5 to 7 sentences. Any suggestions on students that are reluctant to write? Oh, yes. Very middle school students are very reluctant to write because it is a high risk activity that involves a lot of opportunities for failure. Um, Showing them any form of progress with their writing can really help them. Responding to them as like showing the impact that they are having as a writer. So even circling one place and saying, gosh, when you use the word elixir in your writing, I could see how Victor Frankenstein was working towards life, right? Anytime that you circle something they do specifically, even if there is a lot that they are not doing correctly, and say how it impacted you as a reader, that really helps them feel like, oh, my writing has an impact. The other thing I would say about this is if you're initiating a peer feedback routine, you really have to move carefully because kids can feel very reluctant to share a piece of writing with a peer if they're gonna get type of feedback about like, well, you spell so many things incorrectly. I could hardly read it. So you really are training them similarly to kind of look for particular things that are helpful rather than shut the students down. Can I please go back to the discourse? Ooh, what are the best intervention tools and techniques? Small group time. How do I use that well? Build background knowledge is great for whole class curriculum, but seems too vague for targeted intervention. Um, so I might agree to disagree a little bit about that. I think in targeted intervention, if you have 20 minutes a week, you really are aware of what is happening in that grade level class that students are in. And maybe you are giving them some texts that are connected to that topic. So if students are reading Frankenstein, you're giving them some texts that are about popular stories about Frankenstein, but at a lower level, or something about Shelley, Mary Shelley, and her creation of Frankenstein, but again, at a lower reading level, so that you are starting to build their background knowledge that they're going to take with them to their main ELA class, even as you are using those texts to work on those intervention skills. How do we assess to identify word recognition gaps at the middle school level? There are, you know, so there are a variety of ways that are screening diagnostics that are able to kind of test for word recognition skills. M-class is one of them. It goes up to grade 8. So those types of things. There are also more now coming onto the market, something like MoCA screeners that also can kind of think about beyond word recognition skills, particularly for later readers, what might be some areas of comprehension skill gaps that you might think about. So I think there are a number of good ones for word recognition skills, but I would keep your eyes out for ones that are really addressing the secondary reader in particular, so beyond just word recognition and thinking more about some of the comprehension gaps they might have. Um,
I think we have time for one more, Deb.
all right. I'll do one more well, they're just popping around in here. Most newcomers cannot access text in English, nor can they express themselves in English. Do you advocate bilingual literacy while they are acquiring English? I do advocate that it is okay for them to write in their native language. They will still get very similar benefits from encoding, like because they are processing that text as much in their native language as in English, and probably much more in their native language. So yes, I think it is fine for them to, I mean, I love biliteracy instruction, but even allowing them to do certain moments like the writing prompts in their native language while they are acquiring their language skills. All right.
Great. Thank you so much, Deb. That was a really interesting presentation. We love when we can focus a little bit more on middle school. And it seems like everyone who attended today really found this presentation to be worthwhile. So thank you again.
Wonderful. And please let us know for future, what are you dying to know about middle school? And we'll take that into account as we plan additional talks.
Well, thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. Just one more quick reminder that our final session in our week of comprehension webinars is tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, and we're going to be exploring finding the missing link in reading comprehension to boost literacy success. And we're going to be diving more into that idea of mental models and comprehension processes. So you don't want to miss it. So yes, again, we'll hopefully see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. East, and I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Take care.